In this story, you will hear about Belarus and a case that once echoed through it, known as the Vitebsk case, which is associated with a monster we rarely hear about today, named Gennady Mikhasevich. In 1982, the Soviet Union's Minister of Internal Affairs, Vitaly Fedorchuk, after analyzing the crime statistics in the Soviet barn, concluded that two cases needed to be closed, which he considered the most gruesome and harmful. The first case was Andrei Chikatilo's case, better known as the Butcher of Rostov. The second case was the Vitebsk case, which became a kind of explosion for the entire Soviet legal system. The primary source for this narrative was the three-part, nearly 5-hour-long 1989 film series by Viktor Dashik titled Vitebsk's Case. Gennady Mikhasevich, known in Belarusian as Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevich, was born on April 7, 1947, in a small village called Ist, in the Vitebsk region of Belarus, 160 kilometers away from the regional center. There isn't much to say about the village. It's small with a church and the ruins of an old aristocratic mansion. People in that village lived the typical Soviet life. In other words, they worked on the collective farm and drank when they had free time. Gennady's parents were no exception. Perhaps more accurately, his father was not an exception. His father, Modestas, had an extreme thirst for alcohol, and as was typical for a real Soviet man when drunk, he would turn into a violent scoundrel, and Gennady's mother, Maria, often had to hide by simply running away from home. It is believed that his father traumatized him not only by abusing his mother, which Gennady witnessed, but also by terrifying war stories since the war was still fresh in people's memories, and Belarus was certainly not a refuge from all the horrors. During World War II, as was usual in the village, everyone knew everything about everyone, and they would gossip. Instead of sympathy for his family situation, Gennady was given the mocking nickname of the alcoholic's son, so both children and adults didn't hesitate to call him that. If the village children gave him such a nickname, one could assume that Modesta stood out in this context as someone who drank an unusually large amount. Gennady grew up to be a withdrawn, quiet person. He was very shy, which made it hard for him to form relationships with his peers, especially with girls, some of whom would mock him for what they perceived as his weakness. Despite all the teasing, no one noticed any suspicious traits in his personality. As his mother would later tell, once Gennady witnessed a man killing a chicken in their village. Gennady was so concerned about the chicken's health that he even cried. This contributed to the image of him as a quiet and gentle person. As time passed, childhood teasing lost its power. As a teenager, Gennady began a relationship with a local girl named Yelena. The two of them got along well and seemed to truly be in love with each other. When Gennady reached adulthood around 1965 or slightly later, he was drafted into the Red Army. It is only known that he served somewhere in the Navy. There's also a version that while there, he suffered a head injury, which is known to have potential side effects on impulse control. After some time, perhaps a year or two, Gennady began to feel unwell and was sent to see doctors. The doctors diagnosed him with hepatitis, so he was quickly and courteously dismissed from military service. Since hepatitis is curable, Gennady had no reason to complain, especially since his beloved Yelena was waiting for him at home. However, before returning home, Gennady received some devastating news. It turned out that during the almost 2 years he had been in the army, Yelena had found another man and even got engaged to him. This wasn't an extraordinary story for the time. Young couples would often break up when their partner went to the army, assuming that the man would not return. Gennady took the breakup very hard, fell into depression, and eventually had to leave his hometown, where his beloved remained. In the 1970s, he began studying at an agricultural academy located 55 kilometers from Vitebsk. There, he studied mechanics and locksmithing. He would only return home to visit his parents. His student life didn't push him too far away from his depression and youthful romantic dramatism. It is unclear whether due to a potential head injury he suffered or hepatitis, which could also have psychological consequences, including depression. Gennady constantly had dark episodes in which he simply wanted to end it all and commit suicide. One of these dark episodes changed his life. On 14th May 1971, at the age of 24, Gennady Mikhasevich set out from Haradok to the village of Ist to visit his parents. He traveled by public transport. He planned to travel first to Polok, which was in the same region of Vitebsk, and from there to take a bus about 50 kilometers to his birthplace. He arrived in Polotsk in the evening, when all the buses to the village of Ist had left. He had two options: stay there and find a place to sleep, or find someone to take him to his destination. But Gennady found a third option. He decided that things were not going so well, and that he had had enough of this situation. He found a shard of glass and cut a piece of washing line, which he thought was the perfect material for a noose. The only thing left to decide was where to carry out the suicide act. For some reason, he was drawn to the village of Ekimon on the outskirts of Polotsk. Why exactly, there is not entirely clear. There is a version that Gennady's ex-girlfriend used to visit this settlement, and he hoped to see her again before ending his own existence. At the Ekimon bus stop, the man's plans were interrupted by an unexpected sight. A few days earlier, 19-year-old Lyudmila had returned from a holiday in one of the Soviet resorts. She came back with a good tan, which she was not shy to show off on a warm May evening while waiting for the bus. There were no other people around. The young, attractive, and well-tanned girl caught the boyfriend's eye, and all the bad thoughts of suicide evaporated. He must have thought of asking for the girl's number, you would think. Unfortunately, in Mikhasevich's resentful brain, the following idea was born. Why the hell should I be bitter about a woman now? I'd rather strangle someone myself. It's a very interesting transformation when people want to end their own lives, but then they flip the same coin over and decide that they can kill everybody else and be alone. Due to the scarcity of surviving documents and the lack of access to them, it is not entirely clear what made the young man choose this path. Whether it was a difficult childhood, the violence of a drinking father, a head injury suffered in the past, or perhaps the result of all these and other events. That evening, Mikhasevich crept up on an unsuspecting Lyudmila, grabbed her by the neck and dragged her as far away as possible without anyone noticing. Tearing and peeling her clothes, he first raped her. After his disgusting act, he simply strangled the girl with his bare hands. It is not so easy to strangle someone with your bare hands, so it takes a long time to realize what you are doing and maybe even time to stop. Later, Gennady tied the hands of the already dead victim with a rope he had found for the suicide and dragged her body to a nearby orchard where he threw earth and grass on the body and just left it there. He threw the things he had taken from the girl into the river. After this dark deed, Gennady had a kind of enlightenment. When I was strangling, drawing strength through my neck-crushing hands, I was my own doctor. I was particularly pleased when the victim trembled. The pleasure only intensified when she resisted, braved, and fought. Mikhasevich now began to see the act of killing as a kind of therapy, helping him to fight depressive, suicidal, and inferiority thoughts. The official version of the story, which is largely based on Mikhasevich's own accounts, the murder of the first victim calmed him down for a while. However, you are all well aware that crimes motivated by such motives did not end as if nothing had happened. About half a year later, on 29th October 1971, Gennady again had dark, angry thoughts. And in the evening, he found himself in the suburbs of Vitebsk, near a local factory. Near the factory, he saw a woman moving towards the bus station. He caught up with her and asked her what time it was. When the girl glanced at her wristwatch, Mikhasevich got what he expected. Taking out a loop of rope, which he had already prepared and weighed, he put it around the girl's neck. This plan seems to have required a bit of preparation. The young man had come with a purpose, so it could not be said that he was driven by impulse. Gennady probably expected the same scenario as with the first victim, Lyudmila, but something unexpected happened. The girl on whose neck Mikhasevich had thrown the rope managed to slip her hand between the neck and the inner side of the noose as the rope was tightening, thus creating the possibility of delaying her death. The killer had no choice but to struggle with his victim in order to change the course of events and achieve his goal. Of course, the girl didn't have much hope of winning. Mikhasevich was about 180 centimeters tall and certainly not the weakest of men, but he grew up in a village. But the girl did not give up easily. First, she bit the man hard on the hand when he tried to cover her mouth. She screamed as loud as she could, hoping that a passerby would hear the struggle. The gamble paid off. During the fight, some local school children were hanging around, and when they heard the screams, they started shining their flashlights in all directions, screaming and singing. Mikhasevich realized that he might soon have to deal not only with the girl, but with a whole bunch of citizens. So he threw the girl aside and grabbed a rope and walked away. The girl he had attacked survived. She will be Mikhasevich's only surviving victim. Sometimes suspicious schoolchildren can be useful. But Gennady's defeat only exacerbated the anger. He was now dealing not only with the dark contents of his head, but also with an overwhelming thirst for revenge that had to be quenched as soon as possible. The killer jumped on a bus to flee the scene. On the bus, he spotted Katerina, 24, retreating home after her shift at work. Gennady followed Katerina at the bus stop and cold-bloodedly waited a moment to try his luck. The girl's body, raped and strangled with a rope, was found the next morning with a rag over her mouth. From here on, Mikhasevich's story takes on a new dimension and becomes more important than just the brutal tale of another perverted Soviet maniac. Let's go back to Mikhasevich's first victim. The latter was found a couple of days after the murder. On the 16th of May, 1971, she was discovered by a shepherd who noticed that the cows he was grazing were strangely munching on some fruit in the orchard. As the girl's belongings were missing, it was assumed that she had been murdered for the purpose of robbery. After a month of inconclusive investigations, the officer in charge at the time, Boris, was suspended. In his place, the Soviet Belarusian prosecutor's office used heavy artillery. Mikhail Kuzmich Zhavnerovich was appointed to investigate the murder. He had neither legal nor criminological training, but thanks to his alleged merits in partisan warfare and his great ambition, he quickly earned a reputation as an investigator who could solve 100% of the cases he was assigned. At the time, his 100% efficiency did not raise any red flags for anyone. Zhavnerovich was moving up the career ladder. In 1970, he officially became an investigator for special assignments in the prosecutor's office. Arriving to investigate Lyudmila's murder, he quickly found a suspect based on all kinds of testimonies. This was Sergei Glushakov, an unremarkable citizen. Glushakov was not even in the city of Polotsk at the time of the girl's murder, let alone in the village of Ekemen, where the crime was committed. But this did not bother Zhavnerovich. He assured everyone that he had extracted a confession from the aforementioned suspect. This was true, except that the document had been dictated to Zhavnerovich after Glushakov broke down under interrogation. According to legend, this officer was not shy about hitting his chosen suspects over their heads with their own boots, threatening them and ordering them to confess, or else it would end badly. Sergei got 10 years in prison for nothing. The Mikhasevich assassination attempt in October 1971, mentioned above, was sidelined. The blood type of the attacker was determined, as there was blood left from the bite on the hand, but the girl survived, the Soviets having decided to work on more important things. Since the first offense had already been committed, the officials said that it had nothing to do with the second victim, especially since the place and manner of the crime were different. Thus, the two incidents were not linked. The same thing happened with the aforementioned murder of Katerina, whom Mikhasevich followed off the bus. At the scene of this murder, a rope tied in a noose was found, which immediately reminded some officials of the murder of Lyudmila back in May. However, according to officials, the perpetrator had already been arrested for Lyudmila's murder. So the murder weapon, the rope with which Mikhasevich killed his second victim, was simply thrown away to avoid unnecessary questions. The investigators did not like the references to the allegedly already solved case. Admitting that they had made a mistake would only cause problems. Therefore, the clues were thrown away. For Mikhasevich, this was great news, even though he was not aware of all the investigations going on at the time. He continued his normal full-time existence, studying at Horodok College, trying his luck with women. In April and July 1972, he murdered two more girls, Stanislava, 23, and Melania, 18. There is a version that Mikhasevich met one of these victims at a dance party. They attracted each other's attention and started to communicate. They got on so well that they decided to be more intimate. However, the inexperienced and shy Gennady had challenges that he could not cope with, and, as he said, the girl herself started throwing fat jokes at him, after which Mikhasevich became furious and strangled the girl. All these and other intimate details of the murders came from the killer himself, so it is unclear how reliable and accurate they are. The slightly earlier mentioned Zhavnerovich was again assigned to one of these two murder investigations, with testimonies later confirmed as false that three guys were seen leading a German shepherd around the scene of the girl's murder around the time of her murder. The trio of friends were soon found: Valery Kovalev, Vladimir Pashkovich, and Nikolai Janchenko. They were indeed walking the dog in the area. Just one little detail: it was not a German shepherd, as the witnesses claimed. This fact should have immediately made a serious investigator suspicious of the testimonies collected by Zhavnerovich. When the interrogation of the young men began, Zhavnerovich threatened them with the death penalty if they did not confess to the murder. Under pressure from the investigation, Kovalev and Yanchenko confessed, while Pashkovich resisted to the end. Later, his defense lawyer persuaded him to confess. As a result, Kovalev was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, Pashkovich to 12 years, and Yanchenko to 2.5 years. Investigator Zhavnerovich has thus put 4 innocent people in prison without any real evidence against any of them. Gennady reappeared on 11 April 1973. Near the Luchosa train station in Vitebsk, he killed another victim, this time 17-year-old Larissa. He raped, strangled, and left the girl next to the train tracks. After this murder, he went quiet again for a while. This may have been due to changes in his life. Firstly, in June 1973, he graduated from college, became a mechanical engineer, returned to his home village of Ist, and took up a job as a mechanic there. Perhaps Gennady had calmed down because he was busy with his work. Perhaps there were other reasons, or perhaps there is no more information about his other crimes during this period. Gennady returned to crime in May 1975 when he strangled 22-year-old Anastasia near her village. At the end of September of the same year, 25-year-old Tatiana was walking along a secluded path in the evening through the village of Ist towards a small settlement nearby. At the same time, Gennady Mikhasevich, who was going through another of his manic episodes, was passing through the area. Everything was going according to a typical modus operandi. In case you don't know, a modus operandi is a certain set of behavioral habits that are characteristic of a particular person. Mikhasevich jumped on the girl, raped, and strangled her. When the girl lost consciousness, he released his grip. Since things had been going so well so far, he didn't even bother to drag the body off the path. As he was about to leave the body, he noticed that not only was the girl still moving, but she was also trying to stand up after what she had been through. Shocked, Mikhasevich rushed to finish the job. But after grabbing the girl's neck in his hands, the killer realized that he could not strangle the same victim again. Then he noticed the girl's handbag with the items that had escaped from it. As if by design, it contained a pair of scissors. Gennady took them in his hands and did not stop stabbing until he was sure the girl was no longer breathing. After this incident, Gennady modified his killing method. From now on, he will leave a noose as tight as possible around the neck of each dead victim, just to make sure that the victim does not suddenly get up. In the spring of 1976, 29-year-old Mikhasevich married his wife Anna and changed jobs to work as a locksmith on a farm. The new job and family were accompanied by a new home. Gennady moved to a small village called Soloniki, just a few kilometers from Polotsk. In 1976, Mikhasevich killed at least 4 girls. The youngest was just 16 years old and the oldest was 23. This brings his tally to 11 victims. The pattern of the crimes was the same everywhere. Strangulation, sometimes rape. After a while, Gennady starts to simply strangle and no longer rape the girls. The dead victims were found with their mouths gagged, usually with gloves or underwear on. For reasons that are not clear, they began to remove their shoes from their feet and cover their bodies with grass, soil, or moss. The killer had 2 children with his wife Anna, a son and a daughter. He was particularly fond of his daughter, whom he named after his first love, Elena. He pampered his daughter in every way, buying her toys, taking her to kindergarten, weaving ribbons into her hair himself, and trying to spend as much free time with her as possible. He tried to pamper his wife in this way. The killer did not shy away from bringing Anna all sorts of cosmetics taken from the victims, saying that they were gifts from work. The unsuspecting wife could only be proud of her successful, handsome, and respected husband. According to the stories, he and his wife got on quite well. She was even jealous of her friend because she has a husband who is free of bad habits, calm, and always helps with the housework. Gennady and his wife did not talk much about intimate topics, but this was not something new in the alienating Soviet society. Although the relationship was emotionally cold, his wife had some significance for him. During conflicts, Gennady would instinctively grab his wife's neck in her sleep, but he always managed to stay within the boundaries. Gennady was not only a model husband, but also a model citizen. He was active in the local party, at one point becoming chairman of the local party committee for meritorious work, and appearing on the honor board. Volunteers from this party assisted local law enforcement in all kinds of matters. After joining the Communist Party, Gennady even got a red Zaporozhets car. In 1977 to 1980, only 3 murders were attributed to Mikhasevich. In 1981, he began to change his modus operandi. Until then, Mikhasevich had mostly hunted in the evenings and at night, often at bus stops. But when he was in the party, he could see where the investigations were going, where the focus was. With 14 victims to his name, Gennady was already throwing his weight around. He stopped attacking his victims in the streets or on the road, as he used to do, and he stopped killing at night. Now he had a new luxury, a car in which he usually invited hitchhikers or girls just hanging out by the roadside. Mikhasevich would pick up the girl, take her to a remote location, and often strangle her in the car itself, sometimes raping her and dumping her in a forest clearing or in the fields. Between 1981 and 1982, the man murdered at least 7 more women, bringing the number of victims to 21. While 1983 was a quiet year, 1984 was a particularly active one. In the course of that year alone, Mikhasevich killed as many as 12 women. Sometimes he committed his crimes during his lunch breaks. In one particular case, he murdered two women, one after the other, in the course of one day, throwing both bodies in the same place. He had a plan to find a third victim immediately, but ran out of fuel on the way back to the city. When he got to the petrol station, he calmed down while queuing and talking to people, which probably saved at least one woman that day. In the village where Gennady lived, women were afraid to leave their homes in the dark, and it did not even occur to anyone that Mikhasevich, a model citizen, could be the reason for this. In Vitebsk and Polotsk, this fear of women even turned into an economic problem, and during this period, the majority of the population of the Vitebsk district was made up of women. As the list of missing women grew, many refused to go to work on evening or night shifts. The crimes were, of course, a major headache for the militia, the name of the Soviet police, but the authorities refused to accept that the deaths and disappearances of women could be the work of one man. It was more important to produce good statistics than to look seriously for the perpetrators of the crimes. The aforementioned investigator Zhavnerovich was assigned an increasing number of cases in the Vitebsk region. Over time, at least 14 completely useless people were convicted because of him, only to have the cases filed as closed. All the confessions of innocent men were extracted using violence and threats. One of the men who was unnecessarily accused was Nikolai. According to Zhavnerovich, Nikolai, together with his partner Lyudmila, had raped and murdered one of the victims. Zhavnerovich targeted her partner as the weaker link and tortured her until she admitted that Nikolai, with her help, had raped and murdered the girl. This was enough to give Lyudmila 10 years in prison and to sentence the young man to death and shoot him. Mikhasevich laughed at this police work and decided that he could go about his business in peace. But this arrogance got in his way. 1985 was a fatal year. The Soviet authorities in Belarus, seeing that the situation was not improving despite all the trials, decided to renew the investigators in the Vitebsk region and to appoint more officers. Nikolai Ivanovich Ignatovich deserves special mention in this new wave of investigators. The 35-year-old officer was characterized by an uncharacteristically principled approach to the system. In other words, he really wanted to solve crimes, not just report with nice statistics. He was sent to Vitebsk as a kind of dead place where any ambition he might have had was to be stifled. However, Ignatovich did not sleep in Vitebsk and immediately set about analyzing the wave of murders of women. He quickly saw patterns between the geographical area of the crime and the method of killing, and concluded that the murders, which had been going on for almost 15 years, were most likely the fault of one and the same person. Using the available material and testimonies, he even constructed a profile of the Vitebsk strangler. According to him, the killer would have to be 32 to 42 years old, with light brown curly hair, a height of 1 meter and 75 to 85 centimeters, a good knowledge of the area around the towns of Vitebsk, Polotsk, and Lepel, most likely a vocational school education, access to law enforcement investigative information, and a red car. The testimonies suggested that he is well-spoken and good-looking, as several of the victims were last seen getting into the car of their own accord. Although Ignatovich was mistaken about some details, for example saying that the killer was lonely, the portrait he created was surprisingly accurate to Mikhasevich's characteristics. In September 1985, Gennady killed his 35th victim. In October of the same year, a surprising letter reached the editorial office of a local newspaper in Vitebsk, stating that all the women, including almost adolescent girls, who had been killed over the past decade, were victims of their own husbands and partners. According to the letter's author, this was their well-deserved reward for the infidelity they had shown. The editorial board of the newspaper reacted seriously to the letter and referred it to law enforcement. At a similar time in late October 1985, another girl was found strangled to death. The modus operandi seemed to be the usual one. The girl had been strangled with her own headscarf. There were signs of violence and the body had been left on the side of the road. Witnesses said that the girl got into the car before disappearing. The only difference between the other crimes was that a piece of paper was stuffed in her mouth along with padding, with a note that matched the editorial office's letter for treason received the same month. The handwriting read, "Death to the police and communists." The KGB, which had been watching the whole process with indifference, was angered when it heard about the underground organizations of patriots and the letters of death to the communists. The blood type of the sender was determined from the spittle found on the letter sent to the editor. At the same time, the KGB, together with the Ministry of the Interior, sent spelling experts from Moscow to Vitebsk, who began to translate all kinds of written documents. More than 550,000 pieces of handwriting were analyzed, and almost the entire official male population of Vitebsk was checked. This had the immediate benefit of solving at least 220 other crimes, including 27 murders. The breakthrough in the case of the Vitebsk strangler came only after the traffic offenses were brought to light. An interesting detail: in the Soviet Union, it was customary to write official explanations for any nonsense committed on the roads, and this gave rise to a substantial database of written documents. One explanation caught the attention of the graphology experts. It had a different style of writing, but there were too many similarities with the letter received and the note found to be written off as a coincidence. It was obvious that the author of the letter and the note was trying to use a different style of writing, but not so skillfully that a good analyst would not find similarities. The explanation found was signed by none other than Gennady Mikhasevich, and so the noose finally began to tighten around the killer's neck. Once the accuracy of the results was assured, 3 task forces were assembled to arrest Mikhasevich as a suspect. He could not be found at home or at work, but a pile of items belonging to the victims was found in the killer's house. After gathering enough information, the trail led to the village of Horany, near the village of Soloniki, where Mikhasevich had relatives he had allegedly gone to visit. On the 9th of December, 1985, 38-year-old Gennady Mikhasevich was found sitting on a bed in his underwear at his relative's house. He was carrying a suitcase and train tickets for himself and his family to Odessa. Mikhasevich initially behaved calmly when arrested. He even told his shocked wife that it was a mistake and that he would be home soon. The criminal was met at the station by none other than Ignatovich, who was brought back to investigations. Gennady said that one day his car was stopped by some strangers who threw poor Mikhasevich into their car, drove him to some place, and told him to write a letter to the newspaper. Of course, nobody believed him, so he tried to play the madman. But that didn't work either, and the psychiatrist declared him sane. Gennady grabbed the last straw and decided to confess, starting a marathon of several months during which Mikhasevich spent the whole time with a smile on his face and without the slightest remorse. He talked about what he had managed to do in the last 15 years. During the tour of the crime scenes, the remains of 5 more women who had never been found by law enforcement were discovered. Mikhasevich seemed to be enjoying his new celebrity status. The fact that his interrogations and transport to crime scenes would be filmed made the killer happy. During the trial, the mainstream newspapers and other media gave Mikhasevich's personality and his modus operandi plenty of coverage. This means that all his victims have been sidelined, and little information about them has survived to date, which makes the story even sadder. In court, Mikhasevich behaved calmly and coolly, never once showing any nervousness or shock at the crimes he had committed, and even singing in between sessions. Sitting in his cell, he said that when he was locked up, he was finally free from all his desires, so he could read and even have fun. In one of the hearings, Mikhasevich said, "I do not consider women to be human beings. Women have often hurt me, and I have built up hatred towards them. I did not feel any anger towards men, even when they insulted me. But women are to blame for all the troubles in my life." The only time Mikhasevich showed emotion by wiping away a tear during the trial was when talking about his first failed love, Yelena. Whether this was a performance or remained so great is for you to decide. In 1987, Mikhasevich was found guilty of 33 murders, although to this day he is officially credited with 36, and he confessed to 43, but not enough evidence was gathered. He was shot dead in Minsk at the age of 40 the same year. The Mikhasevich case was significant in at least several respects. It finally led to the official recognition of the existence of serial killers in the Soviet Union. The killers were finally separated into a separate category of criminals, which required their own methods of investigation, and Gennady can be considered the first official modern Soviet serial killer. As a result of this investigation, more than 200 officials working in the Belarusian legal system received penalties for abuse of office. However, Zhavnarovich, who put 14 innocent people in jail, received no serious punishment, was sent into retirement, and for the rest of his life he reacted to the whole story with the thought, "And who doesn't? They admitted it themselves." When Mikhasevich was convicted, many of the wrongly convicted had served their sentences in full, and came out of prison crippled and crushed.